Welcome to the Westchester Community for Ethical Culture. My name is Greg Duros. I run the speaker series here. Just so you know, the Westchester Community for Ethical Culture, it's a humanist organization. We do a lot of different programming, both social, cultural, but also related to ethics. A lot of great things. If you're new here, you should check us out. The question of how do we determine what is the best science, right? When everyone's using the word science, what does that mean then? What is the better science? How do we interpret reality? And so I'm very happy that Natalia agreed to speak today on this topic. Let me just say a little bit about her. She's a microbiologist, as I said, with a PhD and postdoctorate in microbiology in the field of bacterial genetics at the University of São Paulo. So yes, she is Brazilian, and she is a senior research scholar at Columbia University Center for Science and Society and a fellow at quackery, USA. She writes for the Brazilian national newspaper O Globo, the Skeptic Magazine in the UK, and Medscape, which is WebMD. She also hosts 2 weekly science radio shows in Brazil, serves at 2 Brazilian universities, and is the president of the Question of Science Institute in Brazil. She has received numerous awards and accolades from multiple countries for her work on science, skepticism, and critical thinking, including making the BBC's 100 Most Influential Women of 2021. And she has written 3 books, and the latest just hit the press. It's called What Nonsense, which has become a bestseller in Brazil. And the book discusses the top 12 pseudoscience beliefs that are popular in Brazil. She's has a long list of accomplishments, which is quite impressive. So very pleased to have you, Natalia. Please take the stage.
Thank you, Greg, for the kind introduction. And thank you all for coming here on a Saturday evening, especially just after the New Year, the Jewish New Year, which, if you are Jewish like me, means that you are still digesting last night's meal. But I think we're good. So I wanted to talk to you today about one aspect of my work. I am a microbiologist by training, but 10 years ago, I started working with science communication and specialized in communicating for policy making. And this is what I teach here at Columbia University now. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the courses as well, because they are part of our talk. But to start with, how do we separate science from nonsense or pseudoscience or unwarranted beliefs, as some people prefer to call it? When we do that, the first thing that we need to do is how to work the screen. Yeah, okay. So the first thing is that we have to agree on what we mean by science, because science as a word has many meanings, and people are used to hearing science being used to justify about everything. If you say anything is science-based, or that scientists say that this or that works, it usually brings some credibility to it, like automatically, especially if you say scientists from Harvard say. I know that they never say scientists from Columbia, so I don't know why that is. So what we mean by science when we're talking about science as a human activity, or in a philosophical definition of science, we usually understand science as a process of investigation. And this process presupposes our ability to change our minds before new evidence. Of course, as long as new evidence is also science-based and well presented and reviewed by our peers. So changing our beliefs before new evidence or before the revision of our peers means that we are open to this change, that science is not dogmatic, it's not written in stone, it changes because we acquire new knowledge and new evidence. And so this scientific attitude that we must have requires that we are capable of changing our minds. In this process of investigation of reality, we can then come at least close to the best assessment of reality in a given time in history, in a specific context. That is a political context, a social context that can also change. So historically, we might acquire new tools that may give way to new evidence, and then we have to change our minds accordingly. And then science changes. It's a process, an ongoing process. So what we don't mean by science, it's not an absolute truth. It's not dogmatic. As I said, it's not written in stone. It's also not anything that's just published in a peer-reviewed journal. So when people say, but I have paper, this paper here that says that ivermectin really cures COVID, there is a paper, so it must be true. Yeah, but it's not any paper. Unfortunately, today it's very easy to publish papers. We have predatory journals, we have bad journals, we have bad papers published in good journals as well. So it's difficult, but we come to a point where the production of science is so widespread that we really have to analyze it case by case. It's not any paper. It's not anything said by a person with a lab coat or a PhD. And we had lots of those during the pandemic, people who had a lot of credibility before their audiences because they were doctors and they were wearing lab coats or they were teaching at a university. And so automatically people believe, but this is a professor of microbiology that's saying that ivermectin works for COVID or anything like that. So why should we believe them? And of course, it's not anything that's taught at a university. Unfortunately, we teach a lot of bullshit there. So, yeah, not always reliable. Some references that I can leave with Greg afterwards, the slides, and you have in the recording for people who want to maybe dig a little bit deeper into philosophy of science. These are some books that I like very much because they're really easy to read. They're introductory books about the philosophy of science. The first one here, the scientific attitude, is where I got this definition of science as an investigative process. He calls it. He doesn't like to use the word scientific method because he says it really looks like a cook or recipe that you can apply to anything. So he decided to create this concept of a scientific attitude. That's how you view science as a process. And all of these books, they're really good reads. So how are we going to separate science from nonsense, from pseudoscience, from unwarranted beliefs that might fool us? The first thing we have to remember is that we are so easy to fool. And Richard Feynman said that we are the easiest person to fool. And this awareness is the first thing that's going to keep us safe. We have to really realize that we are easy to fool because we have a lot of personal beliefs and biases. And it's so much easier when science agrees with those beliefs, isn't it? That it makes sense. But when sometimes science doesn't agree with our beliefs and we don't like it. So we are very easy to fool, and that includes with scientific arguments. So some authors have been researching why people believe weird things. And I think that Michael Shermer was the first author that really popularized science with this particular aspect, trying to explain to lay people why people believe weird things. Why are we so easy to fool? And this sentence I really like. It's in one of his books that's called "Why People Believe Weird Things" that he published in 2011, and it says, when men wish to construct to support a theory, how they torture facts into their service. And we've all seen it done, but we have to sometimes look inside and say, am I doing that? Am I also torturing the facts to fit into my own beliefs because it makes me more comfortable? And this is what we should be asking ourselves if we don't want to be fooled. That philosopher of science that I started the slides with, McIntyre, he also has does a lot of work trying to help us separate science from pseudoscience. And one of the things that he starts arguing is, why is it even necessary? Why do we have to be able to separate science from pseudoscience or from unwarranted beliefs? Why can't we just believe anything we like? And does everything have to be scientific? Because that's something that we hear a lot. Oh, these people are like science religious people. They think that science is the only thing that matters, and no other form of knowledge is warranted or is important for human beings. And McIntyre, as a philosopher of science, says no, that's not the case. Of course, not everything has to be scientific. What would the world be like without art and music and literature? So it's not all about science. But when you have certain doctrines or theories that are making assumptions about how the world works, then you need science to back it up. So it's not all about science, but science is an important tool. And it is an important tool for decision making and for decisions that we make in our daily lives. For instance, when we go to the supermarket and we are trying to pick, am I going to buy organic fruit or regular fruit? And what's even the difference? Why is this one so much cheaper than the other? And why are there so many people telling me that this one is better and this one is dangerous? So we are using science in our daily lives when we make decisions. We all had to use it during COVID in order to get the vaccines or vaccinate our children, or even decide if we're going to believe the miracle cures for COVID. So we have to use science to make decisions in our daily life. Sometimes we don't even notice, like when we go to the market, but we are using what we know, what we understand about science to make regular decisions. And McIntyre has a very good point that he says there are a number of doctrines, theories, practices that pretend to be scientific. This is what we're talking about when we talk about pseudoscience. There are a number of practices that use the language of science. They look like science. It's like they dress up as science, but they are not scientific. They don't want to do the work. They don't want to do the research. They are not open to changing their minds before new evidence. So they are not scientific in essence, but they look scientific, and they look scientific enough so that we are fooled, and we are so easily fooled. And then we are fooled and we buy products that we don't need, and we buy services that we don't need, and we make sometimes very bad decisions, sometimes dangerous decisions for us, for our children, for our loved ones. So, this is why it is important to separate science from nonsense. And pseudoscience is just that, something that looks like science but isn't. So sometimes we prefer to call it unwarranted beliefs, because pseudoscience has been all over the place as a word, and and when it happens, it becomes like a buzzword, and people just used to call, oh, you're a pseudoscientist. I've heard that a lot. So maybe unwarranted beliefs is a better term, but you're going to hear pseudoscience a lot, especially in the literature. And it's just that it's something that is pretending to be science, but has neither the attitude, the scientific attitude, nor the work. They don't want to go through all the work. Some examples that you may heard. So a lot of people are fond of astrology, for instance, especially in my country. I don't know how popular it is here in the US. In Brazil, it's huge. People pay a lot of money for astrological charts, and it's fun. Some people say, well, okay, it's harmless. Why can't people just believe in astrology? It's fun. But some people do spend a lot of money, sometimes lifelong economies on that. And it can harm people. It can harm people if it's used the wrong way. In Brazil, we have very, very funny stories about astrology being used in human resources in companies. So yeah, they actually look at your solar sign to see if it's compatible with the rest of the team before they hire you. So you see, well, this has no limits when people really believe in that. But it's just one example, and it's not science. Then you have people selling a lot of products. There are completely bunk. Like for instance, this one I took on a search on Amazon for Dr. Mercola. I don't know if you ever heard of him. Dr. Mercola has a website here in the US. He sells a lot of products, and he was really vocal during the pandemic. And he wrote, among others, but he wrote this book, The Truth About COVID-19, where he says, of course, that the virus was lab made and it was all a conspiracy to kill all the elderly in the world. It's a and this he makes a lot of money selling pseudoscience to people, and it's not just about COVID. Then you see he has the book, and you're there, you're looking at the book, you're kind of worried about COVID and what people may not be telling you. Then you see that there's so many other products that he sells, and so there's these vitamins that you don't need, and these gallbladder enzymes that you also don't need, and it's everything. It's there on the website, and people buy it. So pseudoscience makes a lot of people very rich. And then, of course, you have we call them the pseudo archaeologists. This one's very famous because he has a documentary now on Netflix, right? Graham Hancock, about ancient civilizations that were hidden from popular knowledge. That's why nobody knew about them until today, until he told us that these ancient civilizations really exist. But you have to buy the book. And of course, I think this one is fresh from the New York Times. The Mexican mummies. I don't know if you follow that, but and we, of course, it's funny, and we may laugh about it. But imagine how much money, public money, is being spent trying to look for these things that are obviously bullshit. I mean, people are actually spending money trying to look for Mexican mummies. And this is taxpayers' money. So pseudoscience can really hurt people, can hurt people's health, can hurt a country's budget. And that's why it is important to learn to separate. So some very practical tips if we're going to try to separate science from pseudoscience in our daily lives. Science will really follow the evidence. And as I said in the first slide, change our minds before new evidence, when of course the new evidence is solid. It will also embrace criticism. That's why we do a lot of peer review when we publish scientific papers. We can't publish if it's not peer reviewed by, or if it's reviewed by critics who are critics in our field. And of course, peer reviewed is not perfect, but it is a guarantee that at least other people are looking critically at your work. You're not alone. You're not a loner, a lone genius shouting to the world about your great discoveries and just expecting people to believe you. So science uses terminology when it needs to with very clear definitions, whereas pseudoscience is going to use a lot of scientific jargon that doesn't really mean anything, but just to look scientific. So remember that pseudoscience's goal is to look very scientific so that they can fool us into believing that they did all the research when actually they didn't. So I'm not going to go through all of this because we can look at it later at home, but it does give us some practical tips on how to separate science from nonsense. I will want to show you one survey that we did in Brazil, in my country. We did a poll, an opinion poll with the population about unwarranted beliefs in Brazil. And it's very similar to the US, but it's nice to see. It was done before the pandemic in 2019. And you can see then it was a relief for us to see that vaccination was really taken seriously in Brazil. We have a very strong tradition with vaccination in Brazil. In Bolsonaro almost ruined that during the pandemic, but we're still vaccinating. But you can see that back in 2019, 97% of the Brazilian population really agreed that vaccines are good for your health. It was a great result. Uh, they also agreed that the Earth revolves around the sun. I really wonder where the 8% that don't agree are, but okay. Climate change was okay for Brazil. We got actually better numbers than the US surveys. So I was kind of proud. But then you start to see some problems. For instance, 83% of the respondents in Brazil agree that alternative medicine is a good alternative to medicine. So this is quite worrisome. And we do have a lot of alternative medicine modalities in Brazil that are actually recognized by the Federal Board of Medicine. So they are seen as medicine. Homeopathy is one of that. Homeopathy in Brazil is a medical modality. It is taught in our medical schools, in our universities, and it's recognized by the Federal Board of Medicine. So to practice homeopathy in Brazil, you have to be a medical doctor. You go to medical school, and after you finish medical school, you specialize in homeopathy. And I don't know how that works, but I suppose that then you have to unlearn everything that you learn about biochemistry, for instance. But they do specialize in homeopathy in my country. So this Yeah, people kind of, I think they keep it in separate compartments in their minds. But yeah, they use homeopathy, and believe me, I got a lot of pushback talking about homeopathy in Brazil. I was sued by the Brazilian Society of Homeopathy. They wrote a lot of notes about me, repudiating everything that I was writing about homeopathy. So it's a huge thing in Brazil. It's very cultural, and it's been recognized as a medical modality since 1980, right? So this is my husband, and he helps me when I don't remember stuff. Well, it wasn't. It didn't go through. So it was that one was easy. But I am currently being sued by an anti-vax association in Brazil as well. So I'm used to that. But going on, so there is a lot of belief in alternative medicine in Brazil, and I think it's a cultural thing in my country. I don't know if we ran the same poll here in the US, what the percentage of people who agrees with this statement would be. Genetically modified food is really standard to be around 70% all over the world. So polls in the US show the exact same number. People are still afraid of genetically modified food in Europe as well. And then you have some worrisome features here too. So 66% of the Brazilian respondents agree that spiritual energy has healing powers. Not everyone really understands or agrees with the evolution of species, the Darwinian evolution. And then, of course, we have the people who like aliens and ETs and believe that ETs really built the pyramids and all that. But really, it's not a negligible part of the population. It's 38% and 31% of the respondents. It's a lot of people who actually believe in ancient alien civilizations, or that we were visited by aliens in the past. It's a lot of people. And we have to deal with that when we talk about pseudoscience and unwarranted beliefs. Uh, Sometimes we start to think, okay, so how do we convince people? How do we teach people about pseudoscience or unwarranted beliefs or science in general? How does that work? How do we communicate science to the layperson, to policymakers, to politicians? After all, if we want science to be taken into account and we want science to be a tool for decision making, how do we accomplish that? We have to be able to talk about science and not keep science inside academia or inside the university and not talk about it with the regular public. I think it's something that we lost in time. As science got specialized, it became more difficult to talk about science in the general debate. But there was a time when it was really common. This picture here shows where the first coffee house in London was built in the 17th century. And the coffee houses in London were very important for science because that was the place where the scientific and literary organizations would meet. And they would talk about art and about literature and about science. They would talk about it openly in the coffee houses, and anyone could listen, anyone could get in. And the coffee houses actually became known in London as penny universities because, for the price of a penny, for the price of a cup of coffee, anyone could listen to the scientific societies and the literary societies discussing science. So science was available to the public. It was present in the coffee houses and in the general debate, in the public debate. But as science grew and got more and more specialized, scientists were not talking about science in the coffee houses anymore. They were talking to themselves in closed spaces, in seminars and congresses and inside the universities. And they were talking to their peers. And the public was not listening, was not invited anymore. We were not drinking coffee anymore with the regular public. We were just drinking coffee amongst ourselves and talking to ourselves. And then when we have to talk to the public and explain how a vaccine works, how a vaccine research is conducted, and why vaccines aren't perfect, then we're lost. And then we have a pandemic, and people really need that information and they need to understand that information. It's not enough that a guy with a lab coat comes and say vaccines are safe. Yeah, get vaccinated. Yeah, that didn't work, and it shouldn't work because people want more than that. People want to be able to participate in the discussion and understand how they came to this conclusion. How can you tell me? How do you know that the vaccine is safe? How was it researched? How does it work? So why take science into account? I think by now, I hope I've made my point, and it's pretty obvious that we need science if we're going to make informed decisions that affect our daily choices. And we need to be able to communicate science effectively and including all the risks and benefits of making that decision based on scientific evidence. Carl Sagan put it, I think I couldn't put it better. And well, he did it like 50 years ago. He said back then that we live in a society that is exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. And he added later that this was a recipe for disaster. And yeah, well, he was right. Maybe we should have listened back then. So imagine if we're talking about using science for our daily choices. Imagine a policymaker that has to use whatever they understand about science to decide on much more serious issues like vaccines or genetically modified food regulation or climate change or even the teaching of evolution in schools, which is not a problem for you anymore, but it's a problem in my country now because yeah, we take our time. You solved that 20 years ago, and now it's Brazil's turn. Yeah, but So this is much more serious issues that are going to need some science understanding, especially for the policymaker. So we come to what I like to call the translational science concept that needs to be broadened. When we talk about translational science, we usually refer to this phrase that was coined to describe translational science in medicine from bench to bedside. So it's all about translating science into products, into technology, into innovation. And this is what we think about when we think about translating science. But I would like to suggest that we make this concept a little broader to include not just from bench to bedside, but from bench to parliament and government. And we start translating science into policy so that we can actually have policy based on scientific evidence and not on wishful thinking or ideology or even worse, pseudoscience. How do we do that in such a polarized environment that we live in? So it's very easy to say, okay, let's do it. Let's use scientific evidence for policy making. It's so easy. I'm just going to present the scientific evidence for the policymakers and say, here's the evidence, use it. And then they're going to look at me and say, yeah, my constituents don't agree with that evidence that climate change is man-made. So no, thank you. I'm not going to use that because people are not going to vote for me if I do. So it's not that easy. Political decisions cannot be made based on science alone. And we live in a very polarized environment right now. And we have these preconceptions that right wingers are the real ones that are anti-science, or left wingers are the ones that are really anti science. But the truth is that everyone has their pet pseudosciences. There isn't a quite clear separation between ideology or political partisanship and what people believe. But there is a myth that all anti science movements come from the extreme right or from the extreme left. It depends on which side of the political ideology you're on. Uh, there's been some very interesting research on that. And there are some things that kind of tend to the left or to the right, but it's a tendency. It's not really something that works as a block, as if you are more inclined to the right wing ideology or to left wing ideology, then you are supposed to believe this or that. But there are some things that are more common in each side of the political spectrum. So usually we see more issues regarding climate change, vaccines, evolution, gender issues, and conspiracy theories in aligned more with the right wing ideology. And usually we are going to see more problems with GMOs, vaccines again, because vaccines are all over the political spectrum, alternative medicine, and conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories are also everywhere. So it is a misconception that anti-science is more connected to either side of the political spectrum. Anti-science and pseudoscience can happen anywhere, independent of your ideology or political beliefs. But there has been also some research showing, here in the US at least, that there are some tendencies regarding trust in science correlating with political ideology. This is a Gallup poll conducted, it was published in 22, and they compared trust in science. So trust is a very, it's a complicated thing to measure because it's opinion polls. So it's really people asking how much confidence, how much trust do you have in science in a very abstract way. It's not about specific things about climate change or about GMOs. It was a very open question, but it gives us some interesting answers. And it shows us that if you compare Democrats and Republicans, their attitude towards science, their trust in science in 75 and now in 21, you will see that the trust in science increased for the Democrats but decreased for the Republicans. We have a lot of hypotheses to explain that. And remember, this is talking about general trust. So it could be about trust in institutions. It could be that when we talk generally about science, the first thing that comes to mind when people are responding are very politicized issues, because it's the issues that are regularly on the media. So it's not something very specific about science, but it's that science that's already been politicized, and that could help explain these results. But anyway, it's interesting to debate. And then we have a very recent paper by Gordon Pennycook and his group. He's a psychologist. He's a professor of psychology in Canada, and he has been doing a lot of research on why people believe weird things and if it's connected to ideology, political partisanship, and knowledge about science. And this paper has just come up, and I thought it was very interesting to bring it up today since we're talking about separating science from nonsense and why people believe. Because there is this, as I said, this preconception that says that it's not about knowledge. Usually, when people talk about communicating science and how do we convince people that science is a good tool for decision making, they say, oh, but it's not about science. It's about ideology. It's not about people not understanding the science or not accepting the science. It's just that sometimes the science doesn't align with what they believe, and then they just don't accept it. But it's not about knowledge itself. And it turns out that it's only half true. And Pennycook, so his conclusions of this paper were that if we're talking about the real reason for people to believe in pseudoscientific claims, is it political motivation or is it the lack of scientific knowledge? He says that political motivation is a thing, is one of the causes, but in very few and very specific scientific teams, not for science in general, but for these teams that have been really politicized. So, and he identified them here. So he says that man-made climate change, Big Bang theory, theory of evolution, gender ambiguity, and the gender wage gap are the themes where political motivation seems to play an important role in what people choose to believe. But he also says that basic science knowledge was actually a stronger predictor of what people were going to believe than political ideology. And this was a surprise, even to us that really work with science communication, because it's very intuitive living in such a polarized environment right now, and we see it happening all the time, and we see that people are weaponizing science politically, and they seem to be making their choices based on their political ideologies and not on knowledge. But he actually showed in the paper that basic science knowledge is a much more important factor, regardless of the political motivations or ideologies. And this is a good thing, actually, because it makes our job so much easier. The authors make some disclaimers here, that they are not questioning that the notion of science is political. They are aware of that, but they are indicating with their results that this politicization of science does not necessarily spill over to a great extent to the regular beliefs of lay people. It stays enclosed probably to these specific themes here, but it doesn't really spill over to any scientific belief or to any unwarranted belief that people might have. And I thought this was really interesting because what they conclude is that maybe instead of focusing on what divides people, we should focus on improving science literacy, on educating people to understand scientific concepts, to understand how science works. And if you think about it, I think that many of us, when we learned science as kids and teenagers, when we were at school, if we didn't pursue a scientific career, we don't have that notion of science as a process that changes throughout time. Most of us learned science as a very closed body of knowledge that we had to memorize for the test. And we didn't really consider how those discoveries were made. We just memorized the results and the facts. So I think that they have an important point here, that maybe the way that we have been teaching science, like this body of knowledge that is unchangeable and very dogmatic, we're not teaching young kids to think scientifically. We are not teaching them to think critically. And then we have a population that's very vulnerable to pseudoscience because pseudoscience looks like science. It uses the same language, the same jargon, they dress alike. And if we are just used to accepting facts that look scientific, we are going to accept those just as easily. So I think they have an important point here. And then I want to tell you a little bit about what the work that I've been doing, trying to educate people, regular lay people, and my students at the university to think scientifically, to think critically. So this is some of the work that I do in Brazil and in the UK. So I just finished, I had for 3 years a radio show twice a week in a Brazilian network. I did write for Medscape. I'm not at writing anymore. They closed the blogs after COVID, but during COVID, I was writing for Medscape about vaccines. I still write for the Skeptic Magazine. This is the UK Skeptic. And I still write weekly for one of the major newspapers in Brazil. And in all of this in all of these endeavors, I was trying to translate science for the layperson. So that concept of translation of science was really important to me. I wanted to be able to translate science as a process and to show people how science works. Much important than say, oh, look at this wonderful accomplishment that science has made. No, look at how it was done. Look at all the steps. Let's go through it together. Let's understand how they came to that conclusion, how they came to the discovery, and how times they failed during the process. So this is what I try to explain when I'm speaking on the radio or writing for the newspaper. Teach. So I'm here in the US as an invited professor at Columbia University, where I try to teach on the use of scientific evidence for decision-making processes, exactly what I was talking to you about, because of course it's easy. I already teach about that, so it was really easy to put it together for you. I also teach about science diplomacy in the public administration school in São Paulo, Brazil. We do a lot of training programs. So science diplomacy is about the use of science for international cooperation. And recently, it's begun to accept the use of science for global policy making. So science diplomacy was, if you talked about it like 10 years ago, it would be just about international cooperation for scientific discoveries and scientific research. But now, especially after COVID, it began to change to include the use of science for global issues. So this is what I've been teaching. And then, of course, and as I said, I do a lot of individual training programs. I'm also a book author, unfortunately, all in Portuguese, but we're hoping to get at least one of those translated into English. But I wanted to show them to you because, well, I'm proud. I wrote them. I wrote them together with my co-author, also known as my husband. In Brazil, he is literally known as my husband. And yeah, it's a very sad situation for him, but very funny for us women because it used to be the other way around, right? We used to be someone else's wives, and now suddenly this was our first book together. It translates to Science in Our Daily Lives, and we won the National Book Award for Best Science Book in Brazil in 21 with this book. And then when they announced it on national television, they said that the best science book goes to Dr. Natalia Pasternak and her husband. Yeah, sorry, honey. It's a good story. And you should see the look on his face when he said, they didn't say my name. But then, and then our second book together was this one. It's called Against Reality. And it was about science, denialism, and anti-science movements. This one didn't get the award, but it ended in the top 5. So we're also very proud. And then there's the new one that I really wanted to talk to you about. So this one was launched, 3 months ago? 2 months ago. We are very, very happy that it made to top 1 bestseller nonfiction book in Brazil. We never thought that we would write a bestseller. I mean, we write science books. They're not usually that popular. But I think what made it popular is that this book is called What Nonsense? And it's about 12 very popular pseudosciences in Brazil. So you can literally say now that half the country hates us and the other half loves us and is buying our book. And that's why, well, probably the part that hates us is also buying the book, which is good. But it showed how divided the country is, and how people really believe very passionately about these pseudosciences. We have one chapter about homeopathy, for instance. We have one chapter about UFOs, about astrology, about diet fads. But the one chapter that really was, I don't know, that really made it to every news outlet in Brazil for the past 2 months. I mean, daily pieces have been written about the book because of this one chapter was the one that took us by surprise, because it was a chapter about psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, which is huge in Brazil. If this book had been written for the American market, probably people wouldn't even notice. Say, okay, who believes in psychoanalysis? It's not a thing. But in Brazil, France, and Argentina, it's huge, and people are very, very passionate about it. So we got a lot of pushback, and very angry psychoanalysts came after us, and it was really really funny. But it made the book a bestseller. But that I only shared that with you actually to say that pseudoscience is very regional and cultural, and some countries have their own pet pseudoscience, and sometimes it varies a lot. And even anti-science movements, they vary a lot. I study a lot of anti-vax movement, especially during the pandemic, being a microbiologist, and I came from a vaccine lab. So during the pandemic, I was the spokesperson for vaccination in Brazil. And I had to study a lot about anti-vax movement, which is a movement that we never really had in Brazil. We have a very strong vaccination program in Brazil since the 70s. And we never had, before the pandemic, we'd never had any issues with vaccination. But with the pandemic, the anti-vax movement began to grow in Brazil, and we were very worried. And studying it worldwide, I realized that it's very different from country to country. In political ideology, in some countries, it tends to be a concern of right wingers. In the others, it's a concern of left wingers. In some countries, it's extremely tied to religious beliefs. In others, it has nothing to do with religious. It has to do with the natural way of life that don't want any chemicals in their bodies. So it varies a lot. It's very cultural and very regional. One of the things that my work ended doing for me, and this was quite a recognition of my work, but really unexpected, is that because of all the work that I did in Brazil during the pandemic, I was recognized by the BBC in 2021 as one of the 100 most influential women in the world, which was really, really a surprise and an honor. But it's great to see that speaking up for science is really being recognized as an important activity as well. So I was really glad. And then something even funnier happened. I was picked in 2022 by the Jerusalem Post as one of the 50 most influential Jews in the world, also because of my work as a spokesperson for science during the pandemic. And you should think that my mother would be thrilled, right? I mean, her daughter was chosen as one of the top 50 most influential Jews in the world. But yeah, my mother is, of course, Jewish. So you can imagine what she replied to that when people, yeah. And her family came from Ukraine. And of course, she said, when people said, "Oh, aren't you proud? Your daughter is on the Jerusalem Post." And then she said, "Yeah, did I tell you that her sister owns a holistic spa?" Yeah, it was hard. But you can imagine who makes money in the family, right? Holistic spa. Yeah. So my sister actually sells all these products and services that we don't need, like homeopathic remedies and florals and energy healing. Yes, and she's the one in the family that actually makes the money. But so my mother's proud, but yeah, not that proud. Uh, to finish up, so how do we solve that? I showed you the research from Penny Cook's group that said maybe we should be focusing more on educating people on science literacy than really focusing so much on dealing with political ideologies. So I want to show you one paper that's been written by two friends of mine from State California. They did an excellent work testing critical thinking education. What they did was to divide students, undergrad students of State California. These were all science major students, and they were divided into three groups. One group took a very specific course called Science and Nonsense. And in this course, they had to study all sorts of unwarranted beliefs that went from believing in Bigfoot to homeopathy and UFOs and conspiracy theories and vaccination. So it was a whole course about unwarranted beliefs and very specific about each pseudoscience that they were studying. The other two groups attended regular science methodology classes. Just regular science methodology that we use for science in general, and with no aspects of pseudoscience in their class, regular methodology classes. And I'll show you the results of that. So what questions were they trying to answer? They wanted to see if addressing pseudosciences directly in a course could actually reduce the students' unwarranted beliefs. So all the students had to fill in a questionnaire, a pre and a post questionnaire before the courses, all the groups, the group that was in their course, the Science and Nonsense, and the two control groups. And they wanted to see if some categories were more difficult, or some unwarranted beliefs were more difficult to diminish. Look at the results of that. It's very straightforward. These are the control groups, and this is the Science and Nonsense course. And this is the pre and post questionnaire and the unwarranted beliefs. So giving a course addressing pseudoscience specifically really helped the students diminish their unwarranted beliefs. They had time to rethink it. They had time to study, to discuss it with their peers, with the teacher. So it's not just about giving the information. It's not just about saying, okay, this is the information, this is the paper, there, it's available. Why aren't people reading it? It's about really taking the time to discuss these topics. And then it works. Then you can really see the unwarranted beliefs going away. And that didn't happen with the regular science methodology classes. So just knowing about science is not enough. You really have to discuss about pseudoscience. I really love this paper. And because of this paper, I started some work. I had no idea what kind of public I would have here, but if there are some educators here, science educators, science teacher, and if you're interested, together with these friends from State California, I started this project called the Lilienfeld Alliance. Scott Lilienfeld was a professor of psychology. He died in 2016, so we decided to honor his name with the group. And he was a fierce advocate for the teaching of critical thinking in psychology schools. He saw the problem inside academia and specifically inside psychology schools. He said there was a lot of unwarranted beliefs that the students had, and this was hurting their profession. So he dedicated most of his life to teaching critical thinking and teaching about pseudoscience. So we created this group. If you want to, you can just Google it. It's in the Skeptical Inquirer page, and anyone can join. It's just a hub. It's nothing really super organized for now. We are just trying to get teachers and university professors together, people who are interested in teaching critical thinking, so that we can exchange ideas, exchange syllabi, see what the other is teaching and what kind of activities they are using with their students. So everybody is more than welcome to join. And with this, I stop. I'll leave you all my contact information, and I'll take any questions that you might have.
Was the doctor about Andrew Wakefield.
Yeah.
And what was scary about that was that it looked to, I'm a layperson, I'm not a scientist, but it looked as if he did all the research and it was peer reviewed and his papers were published in very high prestigious, thank you. I need my husband too sometimes for that. In very prestigious papers. And there was a journalist who blogged it, like he just nailed him and showed how he was a fraud. He was the guy who tried to show the relationship between the MMR vaccination and autism. And it was terrifying because when you read that, you sit there and say, oh my God, it looked like he did everything you said a scientist is supposed to do. And this is a question, and then I have one other thing to say before. How is a layperson who reads everything he did able to distinguish him from a fraud? I mean, how do you know that he's a fraud if you don't read his work, if you didn't follow every single thing he did, and if you didn't know how he fabricated his data? That was one thing. And then the other thing is that the best book I ever read when I was in college 54 years ago, a freshman, was The Structure of Scientific Revolution by Kuhn.
Yeah.
And that's a book that I think should be required reading for every single person in the world. I guess you agree.
Yep, I do. I do. And about Andrew Wakefield, there's also a documentary now. I don't know if that's on Netflix, honey. Is it? Andrew, the Doctor Who Fooled the World. No, and he had a film as well, Vexed, right? Andrew Wakefield himself. Who produced? Oh, he produced it himself, yeah. And with all of those lies about the MMR vaccine causing autism and all that. But the answer to your question really is that we can't expect the layperson to be able to go through all that information and come to the conclusion all by themselves that the guy was a fraud, because it was a very, very well orchestrated fraud. He published on Lancet His paper was garbage, really. We had no idea how it was published. It was later retracted. He lost his medical license and all that. All of yeah, all of because the journalist Brian Deere, and what we need is more people like Brian Deere who go through all the trouble of doing the research and exposing the guy. And there's unfortunately very few people nowadays with the courage to do that. And I know because I was one of the one who did it in Brazil. I mean, I was one of the few scientists in Brazil who actually spoke against the government during the Bolsonaro government because it was an anti-science government. And I was really, even the scientific community in Brazil saw what I was doing like with a lot of resistance because they said you're a scientist, you shouldn't be meddling into politics. And I said it's not politics, it is science. I mean, it's a government that denies science. It's putting millions of lives at risk, and it's not purchasing vaccines because Bolsonaro actually said that vaccines would turn you into an alligator. So yeah, we had to hear that from the president himself. So we had to speak up, and there were very few people willing to do that. And there is no way the regular person is going to be able to sort through all the mis and disinformation that circulates now, even more than when in 98, when Andrew Wakefield published his first paper. So we need good science communicators to do their job and to make that information available. See, to show to the layperson, this guy is lying, and what he's doing is not science, and here's I'm going to show you why. But this kind of work has to be done. Welcome.
What do you say to somebody that would say to you, science isn't useful in my day-to-day life? Most decisions I make, if I'm deciding what outfit to wear to an interview, science isn't going to give me an answer. But if I talk to my astrologist, they're going to give me an answer. I'm serious. Most decisions people make day to day are decisions between two things with not really, a lot of a great, and most people don't think in long-term scientific testable hypothesis, patient, we got to fail a billion times before we come to the right answer. Most people just don't think that way. How do you talk to somebody and say, it is actually useful in their day-to-day life?
When we wrote our first book, the one that got the prize and didn't mention his name, it was called Science in Our Daily Lives. And what we tried to do with that book was really show to people that most decisions we make in our daily lives are based on what we know about science. We just don't realize it. But we are using whatever we know or we think we know about science to make decisions. And when people make decisions based on what the astrologist said, they usually believe that that's scientific. Otherwise, they would discard it. Science is a very powerful brand. That's why so many people use it to market their idea, saying scientists from Harvard say that my product works, or that astrology works, or that homeopathy works. So science is present in most people's minds, but maybe they can't really separate what science is from what it isn't. And I think that's where the confusion strikes. And yes, I think most people don't realize that they're using scientific knowledge and how science impacts their life. And it's our job to show it to them. So that's why we wrote the book, and that's why we work so hard to try to show to the population, see, science is present in your daily lives. It's present when you decide to vaccinate your children, or when you go to the supermarket, or when you decide if you're going to purchase a lottery ticket. It's based on what you understand about statistics and probability. Or if you're going to spend money in a casino, it's also based on what you understand about science. So it's there, but we have to really bring it up and show to people, see, this is scientific knowledge that you're using to make decisions. And it's not easy because, as you said, it's very intuitive, the way people think they make decisions. But it's our job to show them otherwise.
Thanks so much. Interesting talk. I'm wondering if you just general thoughts on, I'm a sociologist, and in recent years, actually, this even goes back to the 90s with the famous Sokal hoax from Social Text.
Yeah, I remember.
So there've been a number of hoaxes, and there's been a lot of attention for people on the political right who want to sort of across the board denigrate academia. They'll home in on some really absurd studies that do exist already. And then, of course, the hoaxers will create. I mean, the most famous recent one is Peter Boghossian and his colleagues, Helen Pluckrose and others, got all these articles published on just absurd topics like dogs having sex in the park kind of thing. And they did get published in a number of cases. So I don't know, have you thought about to what extent the social sciences and humanities under kind of the attraction to, I don't want to label it, but some kind of postmodern sensibility, perhaps, for lack of a better term, might hold some responsibility for producing work that's not scientifically legitimate. Then it gets, again, it's not the lion's share of what we do, but that's what the right's going to focus on. And they're going to promulgate that idea, and it helps delegitimize the trust that exists within the public. So I guess your just general reaction to that. And then my big thing is believing it's all about trust. And maybe I'm a little too one-dimensional there. So maybe if you have any thoughts about the issue of trust as well.
I think that bad science exists in all fields. So it was an example, and I think it was it was good. I think it raised awareness to a problem, a real problem in publications, in scientific publications that are very vulnerable to bad science, to bad methodology. But it's not only the social sciences. In biomedical research, we have a lot of those examples. They are not just as famous, but we have a lot of very bad scientific papers that are published in biomedical research as well, and that gives results that really they are not justifiable with that methodology. And they exist, I think, mainly because of the real problem in science, which is the publish or perish situation that academia and all academic professors live in. That really makes people publish like anything just to get more papers published, because I need it for my tenure track, or I needed to get promoted, or I needed to score points in my career. So I think that those so-called papers, they really they made that very clear to society. And because it was inside the social sciences, I think it became a little biased to say that social sciences have a problem. No, it's a general problem in science. It's not just about the social sciences. But of course, when you think about rigorous methodology for social sciences, it's much more difficult. And this is a question that we get a lot when we talk about, for instance, with the third book, What Nonsense, that we defended the use of scientific evidence. And a lot of people came to us and said, but how can you use scientific evidence in social science research? I mean, you're not going to conduct a randomized, double-blind clinical trial for social sciences. And the fact is, first, yes, we can. We have been using randomized trials for social science to test hypotheses and to test interventions, social interventions that actually work, and it's amazing. It's a good tool. And we have in the social sciences in general, I think what's methodology is getting more rigorous. Perhaps I think you can elaborate that better than me probably, but it is getting more rigorous, right? All the methodology that we use in social sciences, in social scientific research, and also there is a respect for evidence in any field, be it in social science or in history or in the biomedical sciences. It's not just about the quality of the methodology as it is about the respect for the evidence that you get. And I think that should be our main goal in science in general. Don't know if I really answered your specific question, but
Over here.
I think that there's a real problem in the fact of using the paper as the basic method of people looking at scientific theory. In other words, a paper is just about what results can be concluded from this specific experiment, whereas the whole conversation of the generalizability of those results is completely obscured from the public. There's no way to have access to that unless you go to the conferences or engage in whatever form of dialogue that's present between academicians. So that seems to be a major problem, is the inaccessibility of that generalizability discussion.
I agree. I agree. That's why we go. We are doing this work and trying to translate what the paper says, and not just one specific paper, but trying to translate general scientific consensus to the lay public. For instance, there are many excellent books about Darwinian evolution that are written for the lay public, and they're really good. We need more books like that, maybe about anthropogenic climate change and about GMOs and about alternative medicine, written for the lay public, and to bring that discussion to the public debate and not leave it enclosed inside the academia. I agree. Well, I welcome new ideas.
Well, thank you for the interesting talk. I guess I don't know how I want to phrase this, but it seems to me science is inherently a bit messy, right? And I feel like a lot of the conversation around potentially controversial topics lack nuance, lack viewpoint diversity. And I hear similar complaints from academics about their ability to publish articles that may run afoul of whatever boards they have to get through, et cetera. You hear the same thing about the climate within universities, that even the students feel uncomfortable talking about certain topics. And so I'd just like to hear your thoughts on the current climate, for someone like yourself, your ability to even discuss these issues in a way that's nuanced and providing the public with the kind of information they need to make decisions.
Wow, that's a very interesting point. And yes, I think it's becoming more difficult in time to discuss topics that are seen as controversial by the public, and especially depending on what environment you're in. So sometimes, yes, inside the university, it is difficult to discuss specific problems that people feel really passionate about, and then it really kind of hinders the conversation. It becomes difficult to talk about, and not to mention, of course, that it's impossible to talk about anything on social media because people are just not interested in the facts. They are interested in what really will bring attention and clicks and sharing algorithms and all that. And so I had some very interesting experiences on social media during the pandemic. One was when I realized that it was really not about the facts. It was not about what I was saying, about the scientific consensus that I was trying to convey. It was about whether people liked me or not. And so I wrote one column for the newspaper about reproductive rights for women. In Brazil, we have different laws for reproductive rights. But we are kind of similar to the US, that some people view abortion as unlawful and illegal, and it is illegal in Brazil. And I think it's legal in only 3 situations in Brazil. Rape, danger to the mother's life, and then is unviable. So these are the only conditions, and I was writing about that. And my point in the column was not defending abortion or speaking against it. I was talking about abortion rights as a health problem, as a global health problem. And it is, because unsafe abortions can end up killing a lot of women. And that was the topic. But then I released it on social media. I had to at that time. But the way that it was taken made it so obvious to me that it was not about the facts that I was discussing. It was about me. So people started talking about I don't remember who, some random person said that because I didn't have the capability of having children, I was trying to stop other people from having them. And then, so this was the speech of one, like half the people who really hated me, and they were saying that I was for abortion rights because I didn't have any children of my own. They said, yeah, because that makes sense. And then the other half was defending my right not to be a mother and still talk about abortion. And they really, that fight went on for 3 days nonstop, like hundreds and hundreds of people commenting, and nobody checked the fact that I actually do have children. It's funny because I am a mother, and people were discussing the fact that, and even people who were defending me were defending my right not to have children and still talk about abortion. So it sometimes it's not about the facts, most times actually, and that makes it really difficult for people who really want to discuss science and facts and knowledge. But I think it's something that we have to learn to live with, because social media is not going anywhere. I mean, I wish it could all explode. I wouldn't miss it, but it's not going anywhere. People are going to use it, and we have to maybe teach our children how to navigate it better and not be so easily fooled by anything that they read or share on social media. But I think it's a challenge, and it's a very difficult one, and it's a very modern one, and we have to adapt to that. And I don't really have an answer of how we're going to do it, but I think we have to try somehow. And my best guess is education, but it will take long. It's not a short-term solution.
All right, I think we have time for one more question.
One of the major problems of the scientific method is embodied in Anthony Fauci, because when he learned more about COVID and he gave different information, people were saying that he was wrong rather than that he didn't know everything then and he was exploring. And that became one of the most politicized things in this country, which is appalling. You know, it's so important to be intellectually honest, but I really wonder how somebody can be intellectually honest without getting pulled into the situation that he was pulled into.
It is difficult. It happened in Brazil as well. It happened with me, and I think it has to do with what we were discussing earlier, the way that we learn science as kids and teenagers, because we are very used to thinking about science as a closed body of knowledge. It's either right or wrong. It's either true or false. We are not used to thinking of science as a process, and with a lot of uncertainty and with a lot of things that we don't know. We are used to thinking about science as things that we know, that we learned, that were taught to us, and that we memorize for the test. We are not used to thinking about science as a lot of things that we don't know, but really that's what science is. Science is based on what we don't know, and it's based on uncertainty, and it changes before new evidence. And that's what happened throughout the pandemic. There was a lot that we didn't know back in 2020 when it began, and then we learned. But if we have to be able to, yeah, and I think that that's partly our fault as scientists for not investing in science communication and with communication. We have to be able to communicate better with the public, and to make it clear from the start what we don't know, what we are learning, what we hope will change. And maybe if we had communicated, for instance, about mask wearing from the start, okay, this seems to be the best solution now. We are going to advise on mask wearing right now because from the evidence that we have, we think it's important that everybody wears a mask. If that changes in the future, we will get back to you and we will share the new information and let you know. And I think this is the only way possible. And we're still going to get a lot of pushback. Oh, they don't know what they're saying. You see, they are confessing that they don't know what they're saying, that they don't know enough. But at least we are going to be honest all the way through. And I think this is very important. We had a very difficult situation in Brazil with the first vaccine that we purchased. We went with the Sinovac vaccine from the China laboratories, and it turned out not to be the best vaccine available, but it was the vaccine that we had because we already had an agreement to purchase that vaccine. And when we announced it in Brazil for the first time, the institute that was importing the Sinovac vaccine, they made a huge communication mistake. They decided to omit one of the data about the vaccine efficacy. The vaccine, the Sinovac vaccine, was 54% had 54% efficacy for mild cases and 80% efficacy for severe cases of COVID. They decided to go and publicize just the 80% result. And of course, that doesn't work because the paper eventually comes out and everybody saw the 54% and they felt fooled. And I remember that I was there and I said, this is a stupid decision. Don't do it. Don't do it. The public is not stupid. You can't treat people like they can't make their own decisions. We have to explain that 54% result is a good result. Anything over 50% is a good result. And 80% for severe cases is an even better result. But we have to be able to explain that. And they didn't listen to me at the first time, so they publicized it. We got a lot of pushback. A lot of people were really, really suspicious of the vaccine, didn't want to take it. And then they held a second press conference and they called me. And then I explained everything, and it really made a difference at that time, especially in the state of São Paulo. But you see, when people make bad decisions in science communication, in policy, in governments, and even if it's very well-intentioned decisions, oh no, let's not say it because people are going to get spooked by the 54% and they're going to refuse vaccination. It doesn't work. We have to be very transparent.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and thank you all for coming tonight.